So we are going to take a look at Amos, and the today is all background. So, just know we're going to do the first two verses of Amos today, but we are going to get there. But the background is really, really important because it is very interesting, and it is also really important to understand what Amos is saying to his audiences. So we're going to do some background this morning. We'll do background, and like I said, the first couple of verses today. Then next week we'll do all of chapters 1 and 2. So we'll pick up speed significantly. So don't fret. And those two lessons will provide the foundation for all of the rest of what we talk about. And when I say talk about, I mean talk about. We'll be doing discussion after these first two lessons. I'm going to, lay out all this stuff, and then it's going to be your turn to help me, because there are some troubling things in Amos that we need to talk about. We need to have a conversation. You need to help me work through some of this, because I was telling Danny, when I started studying it, I'm reading Amos, and I've got all my notes, and I don't know how you study, but I've got printouts of Amos, and I'm marking on it, and I read a little while ago, ooh, convicted by this. And I read a little while, ugh, this hurts. And like Danny, stepping on my toes, oops, and why did I agree to teach this? Oh my goodness. Can I say this stuff with a straight face when I'm guilty of all of this stuff? So like I said, I'm going to need your help working through this. I need kind of an encounter group to help me process the pain and suffering I had preparing for this. But anyway, so that's the way we'll start. We'll start off slow with background, and then we'll get, in the third week, we'll get to the discussions. So come prepared. Also, as we're going through Amos, I'd like for you to hold pretty tight the lessons that Jen did last month, because the principles that she talked about last month are going to marry very nicely with some of the things that we're going to talk about in Amos. So don't let Jen's lessons get very far from your mind there. Also, by way of introduction, I'd like to say this is not a political discussion. This will not be a political discussion. No, we're not going there. Amos is very often described as being about social justice. And in our country, for the last little while, social justice has been politicized. But I'm not talking about political parties. I'm not talking about political initiatives. I'm not really talking about national politics. I'm talking about moral issues and our self-examination on those issues. So, it's my personal opinion that every single one of us in this room and on Zoom have a unique political perspective. There are no two of us that agree on every point in my understanding. I would suspect that I agree with you on one thing, and I agree with you on something else, and I agree with you on a couple of other things, but there's probably no two of us that agree on everything, and that is okay. I mean, I'm good with that. I value your opinions, and I value your differing opinions on things. And, more than that, I love and respect you. So you come as a whole package to me, regardless of your political stripes. But that's not going to be the subject of the conversation today. We're not going there. It was interesting to me that, well, let me start with this. When I was a sophomore at Abilene Christian University, back when it was Abilene Christian College, I took a course from Dr. John Willis on minor prophets. Okay. Yes, that's a long, long time ago. But prophets are still the same. But he instilled in me this tremendous love of Old Testament history, all of the sweep of world history that underlies the Old Testament. And I have all of the rest of my life loved all of that history, all that underpinning. And I have always loved the minor prophets, and we don't study them that often. And so it was interesting to me, just a little over a week ago, I got a message that Dr. John Willis had passed away. And I was studying Amos when I got the message, and I thought, he would consider that a fitting tribute, I think, So the other thing about that is that, in obituaries, they give their age. Well, when Dr. John Willis was my teacher when I was a sophomore in college, I thought he was one of the older faculty members. Turns out, by doing the math, he was 36, which just horrifies me when I think about that. But anyway, I know, perspective. So when Jen asked me about a title and a description for this, I wrote her back and said, Barriers to Trust, according to Amos. And then I came back and I looked at that and I thought, well, it's not really according to Amos. It's not Amos's idea. Barriers to Trust according to the book of Amos. That's wimpy. Okay, barriers to trust according to God in Amos. But you get the idea. We're going to talk about some of the things that get in the way of trusting God. I told her that we were going to look at the teachings of the so-called minor prophet to glean insights for how God dealt with Israel in the 8th century BC and how we can live a life of trust today. Yeah, I'll stand by that. That's mostly where we're going. But let's talk about this minor prophet thing. Minor prophet does not mean minor prophet. It means short. The major prophets are the long ones. The minor prophets are the short ones. That's all it means. So don't denigrate Amos, please. He's worthy of a lot better esteem than that. In the Hebrew Bible, all of the short prophets are gathered together on one scroll, and they're called the Little Book of the 12. So the minor prophets occasionally get short shrift because of that label that's been put on them. And they don't deserve that, particularly Amos. Amos is probably my favorite one. Shep and I used to argue over which ones were best. He had a particular liking for Micah because of the, do justice stuff. That was probably his favorite verse in the Bible. But Amos is particularly interesting to me because of the literary structure of it. And I'm not going to force you into English class, but we are going to talk a little bit about the literary structure of the book along the way. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about the history. I'll try not to go on and on. This is after the kingdom of David, after the kingdom of Solomon, after the split of the kingdom. So we've got Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And we've got a series of kings in the north that are not dedicated to God. And we've got a series of kings in the south that are sometimes dedicated and sometimes not. And so we've got these split kingdom going on. And that is important to understanding Amos's comments. When I talk about the sweep of Old Testament history, one way to characterize it is who was the world power at the time. David and Solomon reigned at a time when they were the world power. That's why the Jews all look at that as the golden age, because, Queen of Sheba came to visit and was impressed, and, they were expanding their borders, and it was a time of great success for the kingdom. And so the Jewish people have always looked back on that as being a high point, which it was. It was an important period. But then after that, when the kingdom split, other world powers began to rise up around them. We know that Egypt was a world power back, from earliest times. Syria was often a world power. And because of the position of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they were on the path, between all of these world powers. And so there were very often battles fought on their land. They were in the crossfire, literally. So that's important to know as well. Now, Amos is pretty easy to date. If you look at the first verse of Amos, you get the words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa, the vision he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, when Uzziah was king of Judah and Jeroboam, son of Joash, was king of Israel. So we've got a pretty good idea of when this happened because we know the dates on these kings. And so, you can chart out when Uzziah was king and when Jeroboam was king, and, in the middle there where they overlap, that's probably where Amos was. So say maybe 760 BC. It's a guess. We don't know. There's a wide range in there, like 40 years when it could have been, but just pick a year. And this is an interesting time because the world powers are relatively quiet at this time. Now, Tiglath-Pileser, which, by the way, I love to say, Tiglath-Pileser, I know, rolls right off the tongue, had recently come to power in Assyria, on the other side of Syria. And he's gathering strength over there. It's like percolating just over the horizon. And in 20 years, he is going to be leading an Assyria that is unstoppable. But that hasn't happened yet. All quiet over there. All quiet down in Egypt. All quiet around Israel. And so this is a period of time when Israel is enjoying peace and prosperity. They've got skirmishes along the borders and they've got problems of one kind or another. But for all practical purposes, they're getting to catch their breath during this time. So it's interesting. There are lots of mentions. If you want to make notes, 2 Kings 13, 17 through 19 talks about the rise of power in Israel. Jonah mentions the kingdom being restored to its glory in 2 Kings 14:25. So there are documented comments about this time of peace and prosperity. And, as a foretaste of what we're going to be talking about, when you have peace and prosperity, sometimes along with that comes complacency, arrogance, pride, unlovely things. And we'll talk more about that later. But so we have Israel, and if you have access to maps, I would encourage you to get a map. I'm not organized enough to have given you a map as a handout, but if you look at the map, you've got Israel, you've got Judah, and around it you have a bunch of minor nations, and then Assyria, a step removed, Egypt, a couple of steps removed, Persia, even more steps removed. This is before the rise of the Greeks. So this is a time when Israel is sort of nestled in this moment of peace. Yeah, well, Tiglath-Pileser is really cool, but we'll not go there right now. So let's see. Have I told you everything I wanted to tell you about that? Yeah, we're not going to do too much background. But when I'm studying, I just can't help going down all the rabbit trails, So I have notes on all kinds of. Yeah, we're not doing that. So Amos, as we read in the first verse there, Amos is a shepherd from Tekoa. Tekoa, as I understand it, was a nothing village, not of any interest to anybody, about 6 miles south of Bethlehem or 10 miles south of Jerusalem. It's out in the middle of nowhere, not much but dust and, nothing of any interest out there. And so Amos was a shepherd. And then over in chapter 7:14, he mentions that he's a dresser of sycamore figs. It always amuses me how the scholars can get on these rabbit trails. There's so much written about what a dresser of sycamore figs might have been. I mean, I think probably lots of doctoral theses have been written about what it means to be a dresser of sycamore figs. We don't really know. I read a long description of sycamore trees and the fruit that they produce and how, it requires intervention for them to be very prolific in their production. And anyway, so Amos was kind of an everyman. He wasn't special by any means. He was not a court prophet. Some of the other prophets were highfalutin folks. Amos wasn't. He was kind of an everyman. If he follows the pattern in the Bible, he was probably called by God when he was around 30. And he was called in the southern kingdom to go give the word of God to the northern kingdom, which is not an entirely comfortable thing to do because, they've split and there's bad blood between the north and the south. And, so why don't you go up there and say things to those people that are going to make them unhappy? Okay. So Amos had to be a man of some resolve, a person who was in many ways courageous. We need to tell Amos this. Amos was a man of resolve and he was courageous and he followed the word of the Lord. A great namesake, But what he was called to do was not comfortable, and we shouldn't just overlook that. This would be something I would have to think about. was like, I don't know how you talk to God, but, sometimes I get in the, really? You really want me to do that? 'Cause it's, and then I think, well, even Jesus said, isn't there another way? But Amos was called to do something that wasn't comfortable, and he did it anyway. He probably preached in Bethel, which is where the northern kingdom had their center of worship. Because one of the things about splitting the kingdom is somebody got Jerusalem, right? Well, the south got Jerusalem. So, regardless of the rules, regardless of the expectations, Israel had to have a different place to worship. It was important for the national preservation of their kingdom, right? To have their worship in their area. So Bethel was one of the places. And they couldn't build another temple because everybody knew there was one temple. So they built high places. They built places that were more pagan than they were dedicated to Jehovah God. And during this time of peace and prosperity, these well-heeled Israelites would go to worship. Now, I've spent a lot of years in my life getting dressed up on Sunday morning and going to church. And, there is a certain pride associated with that. There is a certain assurance of certainty associated with that. I'm getting up, I'm dressing, I'm getting out of the house, I'm going to worship. Okay, well, imagine these Israelites getting up, getting dressed, putting on their finest, going to the high place to worship, and standing outside is this herdsman from the south. And he's not happy with what I'm doing. He's very critical. How dare he? We're good people. But he's standing out there saying all this stuff that we're going to talk about. And he's going to say some pretty harsh things. Now, what makes it fun for me is, like I said, he's very literary. And so there's all kinds of wonderful literary allusions and, devices. And so while Amos was an everyman, he was not an unintelligent everyman. He was a man with a certain depth to him, because it takes a little bit of moxie to be able to use those literary devices so eloquently. And not only that, he's very well acquainted with world events. He knows all about all of the nations. And it's not just, I don't think, it's not just God providing this to him. It's God telling him what to say, but I think Amos must have had some understanding of what was going on around him. And so maybe that's why God chose him, because he understood things and he had the ability to use all these literary devices to be effective. So when you think about Amos as an everyman, don't think about him as a dummy. Don't think about him as a shuffling herdsman who never gets into town. He's got more to him than that, which is part of what I love about him. So it's an interesting setting for these topics of discussion that we're going to have. Let's see. We talked about Assyria. They're quiet for now. Israel and Judah both had stable governments, kings that were in position for a long time, prosperity. Israel was more prosperous than Judah because Israel, for one thing, is larger than Judah. Basically, it's a split, 10 of the tribes to the north, or 10 and a half, and 1.5 or 2 tribes in the south, depending on how you count it. But the land in Israel is more arable. They were better able to produce things, so they were better able to capitalize on this opportunity, right? Now, one thing that we're going to see as we talk about this is Israel assumed that its wealth meant favor from God. Israel assumed that their prosperity was a gift from God because they were such nice people, right? After all, they were chosen. They were called. While the kingdom split, they still consider themselves chosen. They're the chosen ones of God. And so they're assuming that things are good. So in one way, they're sort of blindsided by what Amos has to say to them. And we're going to see that next week. We're going to see the shock and awe of his message. Yeah, we're going to get to talk about things like the dangers of prosperity, the dangers of complacency, the dangers of worship becoming ritual. We're going to have some interesting things to talk about. Amos touches on all kinds of stuff. Let's see. I think I told you all of that. Okay. Some of the literary devices that I mentioned that he uses that you can watch for is, and I wrote down here, a literary feast. Maybe I should have written a grammatical feast or, something. But if you loved English class and you loved talking about metaphors and similes and parallelism and alliteration, and if you loved all of that stuff, Amos is your book because he does all of it. He even does parodies. He does sarcasm. I mean, I'm right there. I love that. It's great. So he does rhetorical questions. He does all kinds of things. So I probably won't point out all of them as we're going through, but because they're pretty densely packed in this little book. I did at one point think I could come up with some parodies of what we do. I could do some sarcastic comments about things that we get wrong. Yeah, maybe I better be careful here. But it's tremendously effective. And so as we go through, I may show you what it might look like if those things were aimed at us. I had to rein myself back because I was having way too much fun with it. So it's, sometimes dangerous to let me have the microphone. All right. Now, we're all the way to verse 2. Look at verse 2. This is important. This is the theme for the whole book of Amos. He said, "The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers." Okay. This would be when the dramatic background music would come up, because this forecasts the kinds of things that Amos is going to be saying to these people. I'm reading from NIV just because it was convenient. But the word roars there is an important word. Oh, and thank you, Danny. This is perfect. Absolutely perfect. Hey. What this means is that God is loud. God is forceful. God is not splitting hairs. God is letting them have it, right? One of the scholars that I read, let me say, I brought 4 of the books that I've been reading. Of course I did. I brought the smallest ones because they were easier to carry. This one is Preaching the 8th Century Prophets, and it's edited by David Fleer and Dave Bland. You may remember David Fleer. We've listened to some of his sermons. It's a very good book. I also got the classic Walter Brueggemann, The Prophetic Imagination. It's deep but helpful. This is a commentary that's old. It's the Joel, Amos, and Jonah commentary by Kaufman. It was done in 1981, so it's getting long in the tooth. But it's got a lot of really good insights in it. So even though it's old, I've been using it. I am careful about old things. One time when Catherine was in middle school, she was on the debate team, and part of her key argument had to do with the definition of one of the words, and we got it out of the dictionary I had on the shelf in the house. This was, before internet stuff, but she got a bad grade because the dictionary we used was out of date, and the definition we used was no longer in the newer dictionaries. So since then, I've been really cautious about the dates on the things that I use as references. But the Bible's okay. It can be old. And then finally, there's Amos. This is Stuart Love commentary study guide, and it's pretty good too. Now, I have some other references that I'll tell you about as we go along, but they're big books, and I just wasn't willing to haul them down here to class, so I'll show them to you on Zoom when I'm teaching from from Waxahachie. Okay, yes, the Lord roars. One of the sources that's back in Waxahachie said this about this language. Said it's interesting to note that a lion, when the lion is hunting, is quiet. And only when the lion grabs its prey does the lion roar in triumph and success. And this particular writer said, in this case, Israel was guilty, proclaimed guilty, not yet punished, but as good as dead. Ooh. That kind of makes the hair on the back of your neck raise up. But then, it follows with thunders from Jerusalem. God thunders. So you get both the image of the lion attacking and the storm rolling in. So when God starts speaking to you, you need to stop and pay attention. This is serious. And then it goes on to say the pastures of the shepherds dry up. I'm not a Hebrew scholar by any means, or a Greek scholar, But one of the writers said that if you translated this line literally, it would be the pastures of the shepherds mourn. So we're describing a time when, much like these days, the pastures are just devastated. And the top of Carmel withers. Carmel was well known for being a garden spot. It was one of those places that even when there were droughts, even when there were, atmospheric problems and no rain and difficult times of all manner, Carmel was still nice. You could go to Carmel. It was a garden spot. It was wonderful. It was delightful. And Amos says the top of Carmel withers. So this is doom that Amos is pronouncing on Israel. And next week, we're going to look specifically at what Amos says. So next week, I'm not going to be in Austin. Next week, I'm going to be in either Colorado or South Dakota or Wyoming. I'm not sure which day I'm going to be where. But Andy Baldwin and I are going on a frolic. And so I will record a lesson for next week. And we'll go over chapters 2 and 3. And then it's going to pick up speed from there, because then we'll have all the background that we need. So in preparation for next week, look at chapters 2 and 3. And we'll talk through it. We'll walk through all of the oracles that Amos does at the beginning of his outreach to the people. And then, as I said, lessons 3 and following will be discussion lessons where we'll talk about the hard things that Amos teaches, the things that we need to have ears to hear, I think. Okay, let's see. Now, did I tell you everything I wanted to tell you? I think we laid the foundation for this. Yeah, I need to be careful when we get to the satire part. Okay. Okay. Any comments from anybody or questions, or any place that you're interested in Amos that you want to make sure we cover? Yeah, it's yes.
Next week is the rest of 1 and 2.
Okay. Yeah. So if you read all of 1 and 2, you're good for next week. Oh, I didn't mention, just I see in my notes something that I failed to mention as we went by. In verse 1, the earthquake. He saw this vision 2 years before the earthquake. We don't know what that is. We got no clue. But in Zephaniah 14:5, it also mentions the earthquake, which is interesting. So apparently there was some noteworthy earthquake, that made one of those markers in time when people would say, well, it was 2 years after that happened. It was a year and a half after that horrible freeze we had that February. It was, yeah, it was that kind of marker for them. But if you're wondering about that earthquake, we got no clue. So we just know it happened. All right. We'll close today, and we'll pick up next week, chapters 1 and 2, and then we'll get the following week to the discussion. So thank you for joining me on this trip through Amos. I think we're going to have a really wonderful, fruitful discussion. So, thanks.